Good morning, everybody, and welcome to today, this professional development opportunity. This is exploring different types of primary sources. My name is Joe Schmidt. I'm the Social Studies Specialist for the Maine Department of Education. At the end of this session, a survey will be put out for contact hours. This session is being recorded and will be posted on the website probably later today, along with this presentation. So when I talk about primary sources, what I'm really focusing on is it's disciplinary literacy, but we oftentimes get confused between two things, and that's literacy or content literacy, and then actual disciplinary literacy and social studies. And so I want to start by kind of talking about those pieces in that. And one of the things that I like to often quote is Bruce Van Sledright from the University of North Carolina, Charlotte. He contends that in social studies and in history, we don't actually teach history, but we teach heritage. We put forth a list of things that kids should know as opposed to actually engaging in the process of history. And they say that's reflected in what we actually get in our literacy scores. So since 1998, we've continued to see flat NAEP scores in terms of literacy. We've put a lot of time and money and effort in these past 20 years into different literacy programs, literacy blocks, more time, more support, but we still see the same performance gaps. We still see the same demographic disparities, and we really have not seen a change in our literacy scores despite so much focus on literacy. And part of the reason is because as we've moved towards that content literacy, the ability to read, we've done it at the expense of content knowledge and disciplinary literacy. And this is an issue because when an author writes, an author makes the assumption that you have background knowledge. An author can't write everything that's actually needed to comprehend a text. It would be way too difficult. And so they have to have the assumption that you have some background knowledge. So for example, if you came to high school for a US history course and you didn't know who won the Civil War, teaching about Reconstruction is not going to make a lot of sense to you, regardless of your ability to read. And so I will need an example, hopefully somebody that has not done this before, but I do need an example because the only thing worse than a kid not knowing about the Civil War would be a kid who did not know about the montylation of Traxylene. Can I have a volunteer to read my next slide, please? Lex, okay. I think you can unmute yourself, correct?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm going to put the next slide up. I just want you to read it clearly and loudly for everybody, okay?
Okay.
The montylation of Traxylene.
It is very important that you learn about Traxylene. Traxylene is a new form of Zianter. It is montilled in Seristana. The Seristanians gristulate large amounts of Fevon and then broctor it to quasal Traxylene. Traxylene may well be one of our most leucized snislaus in the future because of our Zianter lessolage.
Awesome. Thank you, Lex. If we were in a face-to-face, you'd get a large round of applause for doing a really good job. So now I'm going to come back to this. Lex, I'm going to go ahead and just continue to put you on this spot. I usually open this up to a larger audience and kind of ask everybody, but given the time, so feel free to drop it in the chat box, or Lex will ask you directly. I've taken that information now off the screen. What have you learned about the montylation of Traxylene? What do you know?
It was important.
Okay, anything else?
It affected something.
Okay. If I were to give you a quiz, a test on this, how do you think you'd do?
Poorly, unless it was multiple choice, and then maybe I had a chance.
Okay, well, let's see how you do. I've got a quiz here for you. Question number 1. And remember, on any really legitimate assessment, you have to answer in complete sentences and use your best handwriting. Otherwise, it doesn't count. Okay, what is Traxylene, Lex?
It's a new form of Zianter.
Congratulations, 1 for 1. Where is Traxylene montilled?
Seristana. Traxylene is montilled in Seristana.
How is Traxylene quazzled?
First they gristulate large amounts of Fevon, and then they bractor it.
Okay. And why is it important to know about Traxylene?
It's one of the most leucized sneezelaus in the future, or it will be, because of Zianter lessolage.
Awesome. 4 for 4. Lex, I thought you said you didn't learn anything.
I know how to regurgitate information.
Ah, see, it's a text-dependent question, and we do this a lot of times in our content areas. We give students reading passages, then we back it up with worksheets or quizzes or kind of straightforward pieces where what we're actually just really asking them to do is do a close read back to what it was and pull out key information. Now, Lex, I won't hold this against you because this is a common assumption I make just for any time I do this. If I were to check in with you later today, without the reading prompt, how do you think you'd do on those 4 questions?
Probably pretty poorly.
So what did you learn today?
I learned how to regurgitate information if I looked at the text.
Right.
Like,
and
oh, the teacher wants the text, so here you go.
You did not build any comprehension of this information. You aced your test, we put it in the grade book, and then we've moved you forward. And we do this over and over again with students, especially in our content areas of science and social studies, especially in the younger grades. We give them little bits of information. We check to make sure that they've been able to transfer that piece, and then they move on. My favorite little thing to really blow your mind in this is, Lex, how do you think you would have pronounced the word Traxoline? I introduced it twice, very specifically by saying you're going to read about the montylation of Traxoline. If I had called it the montylation of Traxoline, what do you think you would have said?
Traxoline.
Traxoline, right? We all use cues all the time. So Lex, not even knowing what was about to happen, picked up on cues as, you know, again, there's Lex is an adult. He's going to have different levels, but the kids are going to do the same thing. A struggling reader or even a successful reader is finding any and all cues possible to try to work with this. And I can't take credit for this. I always have to credit this as Judith Lanier from the University of Michigan with the montylation of Traxoline. Okay. So what happens then? We see this over and over again. Tierney and Pearson in 1981, they have what we now know as the cricket study. And I give you the little clue there by putting the cricket piece, and I've told you the cricket study. But there's a reading. I'm not going to read it to you. This was given to elementary students. I think it was grade 4 and 5 students in America, and they were asked what it was about. And regardless of reading level, the kids didn't have a clue, because it was not about their ability to read. It was about background information and content knowledge. They couldn't understand what an occasional 6 were and a batsman or a stump because it was not part of their schema of understanding. This was repeated again by Recht and Leslie in 1988, although they put one twist on it, which became a very important study when it comes to disciplinary literacy. They had 4 types of kids. They had kids who were good readers and kids who were poor readers, and they had kids who enjoyed baseball and liked baseball and kids who didn't. So you had 4 different combinations of them. They were given readings about baseball, and again, this was 4th grade students. They were given passages about baseball and then asked comprehension questions about it. Students who were good readers, strong readers, and liked baseball, unsurprisingly did the best. Okay, they had every advantage going for them. What was surprising was that poor readers who knew baseball did significantly better than strong readers who didn't know baseball. And in fact, if you look at the data points and extrapolate out the data, what they've done since this in 1988 and have done repeatedly over and over again is that the #1 indicator of a student's ability to read is background knowledge, not ability to read, not a phonics comprehension piece, or a fluency piece, a fluency piece. But it's really about that comprehension, and this has been repeated over and over again. And so one of the things that we talk about, and we're going to get to primary sources, but I'm telling you why we have to attack primary sources the way we're going to attack them, is that people will say, well, social studies isn't tested. And I'll say, yeah, it kind of isn't. But then I continue to look at the SAT scores and the rubric. And there's 3 categories that students will get scored on. And one of them is analysis. And these are the 4 bullet points that when a student does their essay on the written part of the SAT for analysis, that this is what they're going to get looked at. They're looking for insightful analysis, well-considered evaluation of author's use of evidence. They're looking for sufficient and strategically chosen supports for claims, and they're focusing on the features of the text that are most relevant to the task. Sounds good. To me, this is social studies. It's identifying a source. It's looking for evidence, reasoning. They're pulling the pieces together. It's claims, evidence, and reasoning to support. What is the task? What is the question? Does anybody know what the average student in Maine gets? The last time I got the numbers in the analysis portion of this, The lowest you can get is a 2, the highest you can get is an 8. 2 judges will score your writing, and they will give you a score of 1, 2, 3, or 4. So the lowest is a 2, highest is an 8. Would anybody like to guess what the average Maine student gets on analysis? Sonia says 4, Gina says 4. Anybody else want to guess? Pam, correct. Pam says 3. The average student gets a 3. That means the average student has one of their judges giving them the lowest possible score. This is what a 1 looks like. In order to get a 3, that's a 1 and a 2. A 1 means there was little or no analysis that identifies without explanation the evidence. The analysis is unwarranted. There's little or no support. It's irrelevant. There's no discernible analysis. This is what the average kid is getting from half of their judges when they're doing the SAT. This is social studies. So if we are doing social studies with a proper disciplinary literacy focus, then this is a home run. And see what I did there? We went from the baseball study to an analogy of hitting a home run. So in order to get kids to be better at analysis of these primary sources and of the social studies world, taking from Jeffrey Noakes from BYU, I've slightly adapted it. He works mostly in historical thinking strategies, so I've kind of adapted it for social studies in general. But social studies literacy, as I look for kind of 4 things in here, it's the ability to construct meaning. They have to do something with what they're reading with multiple genres. They have to critically evaluate a text. They don't take it for face value. They have to look at it in context of what others have done. They have to use the text as evidence in the development of their own work. And then they have to be able to create multiple types of texts. This is what it means through disciplinary literacy and social studies. Construct meaning by critically evaluating a text to use it as evidence to create your own. That's what historians do. That's what geographers do, political scientists, economists, et cetera, et cetera. That's what students need to be doing. They need to be practicing and getting better at being a criticalist. They don't take one side or the other. They don't believe the first thing they're going to say. Cynthia Shanahan uses the term healthy skepticism, a healthy dose of skepticism. They don't take anything at face value. They're willing to hear all sides until they've been properly evaluated and then determined which one is superior. They do not go in with a preconceived notion. So things that students need to be able to do in order to be a criticalist is they must be actively engaged in the process of disciplinary thinking. You have to give them room to practice this stuff. It is not passive. Learning is not passive. Social studies is not passive. History, and I'm going to know I misquote this, a friend of mine always reminds me that the Latin roots of history is a process, it's a verb. History is a doing. They have to be allowed to construct their own independent interpretation. There isn't a right answer. Give them the primary sources and let them take a side and then defend it. We need to minimize the amount of times we say, yes, that's correct, and no, that's wrong. Now, there's going to be basics in understanding, building that knowledge, right? The Civil War took place from 1861 to 1865. They need to understand that. There are right answers. They can't talk about the Civil War, of 2017. That doesn't fit in. But what we really need to be evaluating on is their ability to process that information. You support this by making sure that they are aware of the strategies that they can use to effectively weigh the evidence. If you give kids conflicting views in a handful of primary sources, they're not going to know what to do with it. You build in those strategies and supports to help them understand what to do with that. And then, again, that claim has to be made on evidence, right? They can't just take any side for no reason and say, well, the sky's purple and I just like it that way, so give me my A, right? There's my claim. It's all back to evidence. And I always tell teachers that when you're working with students with documents, primary sources, secondary sources, textbooks, anything, the student must be able to point at their evidence. It can't really be a conglomeration of, well, I've heard this, or I've seen this, or I think that. They need to be able to start by pointing at things. That's their evidence. And so if we look at the way Stanford History Education Group, or SHEG, looks at this, they talk about 4 key skills. And these are the 4 skills that I used when I did the hands-on history part on Tuesday. We talk about sourcing a document, contextualization, corroboration, and close reading. When you give kids information, a textbook, a secondary source, or in today's stuff, primary sources. These are the skills they need to be able to do to handle those sources. And what I really, really love about this chart is it gives you the first column, what the skill is, the second column, what's the question you should be asking kids. If you want kids to be sourcing a document, they should be able to answer who wrote it, what is the perspective, when, where, why, and is it reliable? If you need to be putting learning targets up on your board, your third column there, students should be able to, there's your learning target. Today we will hypothesize what the author will say before reading the document. And if you want them to do writing prompts and writing checks, use the last column, column 4. At the end of today, based on the source information, I think the author might, ... fill in that writing. There's your assessment piece. What do you ask them? What are we going to do? And how do they write about it? And again, all 4 of those skills. So let's look at some of these skills. So when given primary sources, the first thing we talked about this again on Tuesday was the idea of sourcing a document. You have to know where it's coming from. So I've got some great pieces in here. I love them. I always love when people make fun of, oh, do you remember when they used to say doctors, endorse smoking or whatever? They never said that. More doctors smoke Camels than any other cigarette. Doctors smoked. If more doctors smoked Camels than any other brand, that's a true statement. It doesn't say Camels are good for you. It doesn't say Camels have any health benefits. We make assumptions that a doctor would make a good choice. That's not true, but that's still a valid source according to repeated nationwide survey, right? There's the question always about Google versus Wikipedia and how do we value those sources and where do we bring it in? Bottom left, there's an advertisement for snake oil. It's wonderful stuff according to this guy. Do we believe him? Bottom right-hand corner, Dewey defeats Truman. Mr. Schmidt, I never heard of a President Dewey. What happened? Is this fake? No, that's a real newspaper. That's a real picture. That's really Truman. The paper was wrong when it printed itself. That's an actual document that's not been doctored in any way, shape, or form. And so one of the things, okay, I don't want to say it there. Okay, because one of the things we have to talk about is what a primary source is. And we'll get to that in a second. So for the group, you can either put it in the chat box. I can't quite see everybody on my one screen, but if you have your cameras on, you can hold up fingers 1 or 2. So let's evaluate a source. This is what I would have kids do. Give them a primary source or have them think about sources and say things like, if you were trying to figure out who was present at the signing of the Declaration of Independence, do you rely on source number 1, which is a Hollywood movie made about the American Revolution in 2001? Or do you rely on source 2, a book written by a famous historian who's an expert on the American Revolution published in 1999? So class, which one? Jim says 2, Sonia says 2, Alexa, all the screens I can see are 2s. Would anybody like to tell me why? Why 2? Jim, go ahead.
There's a few key words in there, famous historian and an expert on the American Revolution. So with that being said, that just leads me to believe that as I get into that text, it's going to give me accurate information based on being an expert in the American Revolution.
Awesome, thank you. What if this was presented, and this is a true story, what if this was presented to students and a student said number 1 because it's more modern, it's 2001 to 1999, so that gave us 2 more years to learn information. A Hollywood movie may actually imply multiple historians, and Mr. Schmidt, you've told us that you want to be able to corroborate information across multiple sources. The book is just one historian. A Hollywood movie would probably have multiple. So it's newer, more information, and possibly multiple sources. Therefore, I say number 1. Is that student right or wrong? Jim, go ahead.
I'd probably follow it up with another question. I mean, it would take, you possibly could be right. However, let's take a look at who those people are that did that research for this movie. What we do know is Hollywood is for entertainment. So with that being said, are we being entertained or are we being educated?
Sure.
We can do both, but let's take a deeper dive into that.
Absolutely. And that's where I would go in and look. I'm not going to tell a kid right or wrong. I want to know what the kid's thinking. And I think there's a lot of legitimate pieces in there. There's a lot of fallacies in there as well about what Hollywood do, right? I always love to talk about inspired by a true story. So one day I was driving through the woods and it was kind of sunset and it was getting a little dark and spooky, and I came around a corner and I swore there was this Tyrannosaurus Rex that was running out of the woods at me. But then it turns out when my car lights came around, it was just a tree that had kind of fallen down. But boy, can you imagine if there was like a park where they had dinosaurs and you could go pay to go watch dinosaurs, like they brought them back for life? Jurassic Park, inspired by a true story, because that was a true story. I was driving down the woods and thought I saw a dinosaur, right? So inspired by a true story is very, very different than based on a true story when it comes to movies. But I always want to make sure kids have the ability to talk about the source and what they think about it. What about this one? Source number one. The question is, what was slavery like in South Carolina? Would you want to have an interview with a former slave in 1936 where the interviewer was a black man or where the interviewer was a white woman? Does that matter? Which is more reliable, class number one or number two? I see one, I see one, I see one. Would anybody like to argue for two? Sonia?
It could be that the white woman might not have a bias built in. So it depends on the individual that's doing the interviewing.
And I've also heard things like, well, there might be more like empathy or sympathy, or might want to play up the stories to be like, oh, you remember what it was like, right? Like that shared bond of peace. Although if I'm remembering correctly, I think I do believe Stanford says that this is number one based on the familiarity of interviewing somebody who's more like you, that more relatable in the experience. John and Betsy, yep. Yeah, there's all sorts of different ways. And this is where John and Betsy in the chat room said it could gain information from a different perspective. And this is where you wouldn't just, again, have one source and say, well, this is the end all be all. I would look for sources, one where it was a black man, one where it was a white woman, get a variety of them. What are the commonalities we're finding? What are the differences in them? How could you explain those differences, et cetera, et cetera. If you want to know what the layout of a Nazi concentration camp of Auschwitz looked like, should you go to source one, an interview with an 80-year-old Holocaust survivor in 1985, or a map of a concentration camp found in Nazi files? One or two? Pam says two, Gina says two, Sonia says two, Lex says two, John and Betsy two, Craig two. The big thing with this is Stanford is they want students to understand that memories are really, really bad sources of information. One of my favorite pieces to reflect, it's a podcast series called Revisionist History by Malcolm Gladwell. There was a group of sociologists in New York during 9/11, and they understood, and they said, we understood like this was a very difficult situation, but we also saw an opportunity to do something, with that time. And within the days following 9/11, they went and interviewed a bunch of people about what they were doing that day. When you found out, what were you doing? What was going on? And then they followed up with them a year later, 5 years later, and 10 years later. And just 1 year later, I think it was only like 60% of people were able to accurately describe what they were doing when they heard within a year. And it continued to drop at the 5-year mark, the 10-year mark, right? Although when you look at this one, like source two, I'd want to say, I want to know more information. Like, was this a map from 1931 where we're still like 8 years away from Auschwitz? Is this a propaganda piece of a map that showed up in an advertisement? Or, I think one from an advertisement, but right, there's different ways. I can draw all sorts of maps if I'm trying to hide what's going on, if I'm trying to plan something. Was it a map after it had been built? Did it make notations about where Jews were being held or executed? Is that on there, right? So I'd want to know more about it, but the general idea of this one is that memory is really, really bad place to try to source information. And this was what I was almost going to reference earlier and forgot to came back to. On the left is a letter written by General Dwight D. Eisenhower, and on the right you see the transcript, or I put our landings in the Cherbourg-Hava area, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. where Eisenhower is talking about the failure of D-Day. And if a student gets a hold of this, they would have to assume that D-Day failed. The sourcing is correct, it's the right year, although ironically enough, he dated it wrong. He dated it July 5th, not June 5th. I guess he had a lot on his mind that day. But the author's correct, the sourcing, the information's correct. So then do we have to assume that it failed? And so the point of this one is the idea that primary sources are just evidence. It's just part of the story. Eisenhower wrote 2 letters the day before. One commending the troops for an amazing, human spirit and victory and what they had overcome. And this is the one that was actually sent out. But in his presidential files in the library, they eventually found his letter that he had written in case of failure. Is it a primary source? Absolutely. Is all the sourcing information correct? Absolutely. Is it a fact? It's not. It's just evidence. All primary sources are just evidence that you pull together. And so looking at this, I'm going to kind of shift over to artifacts now, because I like to think about the other ways. I think we oftentimes get caught up in just the written pieces of primary sources. And so this is from Ethelbach and Cho in 2009. Have your students look at something and write down observations and inferences. And this is something we're actually really, really bad at. So if there's somebody who's willing to unmute themselves, I'm going to show you a picture and I want you to tell me the things you observe. Anybody willing to unmute and tell me what you observe?
Sure, Joe, I'll do it.
All right, Jane, I'm gonna give you the next picture. Just tell me what you observe, okay? Observations only.
Some sort of old tag.
Okay, I'm gonna stop you right there. This is where we're really bad. Is old and tag an observation or an inference?
Old is an inference.
What about tag?
No, that's a tag.
Are you sure?
Well, yeah, I guess. Oh,
me
yeah,
what-
it's an inference. It's based on some tags that I've seen, but it doesn't mean that that's a tag.
Right, you're pulling together what you see and you're building it into a schema right away to try to figure out what it could be. This is what we do. We want to make sense of the world around us. So Gene, I'll give you a second chance here, and nobody's very good at this right off the bat, so I don't want you to feel bad at all. What do you see? No inferences, pure see.
I see words, men, women, children, total. Can't read what it says at the bottom. I see some sort of markings, maybe punch holes, or anyways, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16 markings, I think. I see the number 9. I see a hole at the top with some sort of rope or wire or cord coming through.
And even in that, Gina, thank you very much for putting yourself out there and trying it. Even in there, I don't know if anybody heard, she was struggling to just stick with observations. A couple of things she even said, well, I think they might be punch holes, right? There's something there. Based on the lighting of it, we assume that they're holes, and something like this, we assume like they're uniform, right? So it must be a punch thing. There is something that, there is 16 of something. Could it be a magical, like I've seen, right, the stickers that they shade it just well so it looks 3D, right? We don't know. There is a number 9. A lot of times people will say, well, there's 9 men, women, and children in that family. No, there's the number 9 written next to the words men, women, children, and total. We assume that's what it is. I would think that's a really good inference. Gene, I think all your inferences are solid, but they are just inferences. And really getting kids to slow down. We really are always wanting to jump into inference. I want to say it's Noakes, but I think Noakes is quoting somebody else. When you do work like this, kids who have a lot of background knowledge will jump to inferences because they're able to piece it together. Kids who don't have a lot of background knowledge are actually really good at observing because they can't put the pieces together. They can only just tell you what they see. If you look really, really close, you find out it's a tag for American Indian resettlement for a ration tag. But you have to really know the years, the timing, the stuff like that. And if a kid doesn't know, if you don't have experience with a tag or punch holes or whatever, they're not going to be able to make those inferences. So really slow kids down and make them do observations and inferences, because it's something we're not good at, especially with visuals. We assume we take it all in at the same time. I love these. This is from my friend Glenn Wiebe in Kansas. I'm not trying to sell them. I'm just using it as an example. These have, you notice the vis-a-vis markers over the top. It's kind of a laminated piece with your different questioning on the side. But what you're doing is you're just annotating the picture. Have them draw on it. Think about it. What could it potentially be, right? Potential, future, anything's possible. They see happy children. Who created this? They drew the line down to try and find sourcing informations. Make them chunk it out. Another thing that I've seen Glenn do at a conference is he takes a piece of paper and he cuts like 2 L's out of it. Like if you were to cut, do you guys see my mouse or just the screen? The mouse too. Like if you were to cut it here and here, you would have 2 L's that you could actually contract down to just a small square. You don't have to have them connect at the sides. You could move this chunk way down and just do it there. And so he calls it framing. So one of the activities he has for students is he says, just frame the first thing that catches your attention. And then they frame out and they zoom down so that they're just looking at, let's say, happy children. That's it. Force them to dig deeper into that. You can do this by doing the framing yourself. This is a famous painting. You've probably seen it. But there's different ways of forcing you to look at it differently. It helps get the color. This is darker. The American Indians, the tribes, they're looking back into the darkness. Is that symbolic? Because look at, here comes light. What's that in her hand? Telegraph cord. What's that in her, what's the book say? Look how bright it is over here with European settlement and civilization. And here come the trains and the ships. We still have farmers working, but look, here it's like hand horses. Here it's oxen pulling a plow. You have you have wagons, then the faster stage coaches, than the trains. But there's a lot of things in here that you can just force kids to chunk it out one at a time. And just all I did was just grade out the other areas. When you're looking at portraits, these are things from the Kennedy Center for the Arts. I really focus usually on the first 6. Facial expression, focal point, gestures, clothing, setting, objects. It's a little sing-songy thing that they teach us. And so you talk about facial expression, focal point, gestures, clothing, setting, objects. What are in those paintings? What do you see for facial expressions? What do you see for focal points? Where are they looking? They're looking here. He's looking here. He's looking, is he looking at us? Is he listening to here? Some people are looking at the painting. Some people are looking at George. What does that matter? What does that mean? Are there any gestures? What are they doing? What are they wearing? What's the setting? They're in a room. Are there any objects? Yes, this is supposed to be the signing of the Declaration, or not the Declaration, of the Constitution. But you don't just passively take it in, step them through. Ask your students questions. When I see, it makes me think, it makes me feel, it makes me wonder. Or you can flip those writing prompts. I think blank because I see blank. Again, with visual images, and I love doing visual images because it takes reading levels out of the equation. So you can do them with young kids, you can do it with differentiated reading pieces. We see those pieces, but you still have to slow kids down. We, again, naturally assume that the moment we've seen it all, that we've seen it all, which is not true. Remind kids They're really better at this when it's a written piece, understanding that somebody wrote it and the flaws of that. But the same thing with a photo. Somebody took the picture. There's an author to that photograph. Somebody's behind the lens. You would want to know who wrote the diary entry. You need to know who took the photo because it matters. Because photos have a purpose. I oftentimes use the famous Napalm Girl picture, and then I ask, could there be anything right off the side of the picture that changes its meaning? Because the photographer could have chosen to intentionally leave it out. Did this photographer have her pose? Did they find her sitting here? Or the kids' reactions? Why were the kids' reactions? How many photographs of, because what this is migrant, was it migrant mother? How many photographs were taken right here? 1, 2, 50? Was this the most powerful in terms of understanding the depression? Was 2 pictures before this? Was she smiling? Why wouldn't you use that? Was that intentional? These are all things. We get this snapshot and we often just assume, well, it's a picture, so it's accurate, right? And it might be accurate, but it doesn't mean it's the full truth because we have no idea what's over here. What's over here? What happened the second before? Did they intentionally throw out a picture? Did they intentionally crop a picture? Look at these 2 photos. Anybody notice who's out here on the periphery of the wide angle shot? Gina's nodding her head. What do you see, Gina?
I see a black man at the end.
Why did we crop him out of this photo? If you search for this photo, you'll see these 2 versions, although this closer up view here on the left is more commonly used. Was it intentionally cropped out? Was it meant to do this? Did it fit a better size of a publication that was choosing to use it? And I keep waiting for somebody to catch me on this, and nobody ever does, although you guys don't have the greatest screen and I'm moving pretty quick. I'm actually lying to you with this because they're not the same photograph. Look very closely at Teddy, right over here. Flags waving back, nobody's in front of him, hats on. Here, there's people standing in front of them, flags waving down, hat off.
Hat off, yeah.
So it's not the actual same photo.
The flag is blowing differently too.
Yep. Kind of waves back here versus here. But then I love, this is where I go, I don't know if anybody remembers old glamour shots, but is that what happened? Was this photographer here and at some point, like, was the bottom right one the first one? And is the photographer saying, okay, no, guys, move, guys, get out of the way, move. Teddy, put your hat back on. Put that hat back on, Teddy. Let's get, somebody wave the flag here. Here we go. Ready? And action. Yes, shot. Oh, Teddy, put it back on. Oh, take it off. Give me hands on your hips. I don't know, right? This could have all happened. It's a photograph. It's true, or it's accurate, but we don't know what got us there. Fact versus reality, truth. Our photographs, so I come back to this one because were the individuals purposely cropped out when people are using the one on the left? Was that intentional? Was it a better shot? Was it just because it was closer? Was it better because Teddy had his hat on? I don't know. But this is the healthy skepticism that kids should be thinking about. How many people have seen these pictures? Just any of them in general, the old desert scene with the cattle skull laying there. What's the problem with them? Anybody see a problem?
Is it the position? It wouldn't really always be upright like that?
That might be true. I see a bigger issue. Thank you, though. Good observation. What is implied with the cattle skull?
Well, the implication is, my inference is that there's a drought and all the cattle died, and the people are, they're going to starve because they can't raise their.
That's the message being, don't mute, Gina. Hold on, I'm gonna follow up.
Okay.
That's the message, right? That's what that feeling is. Death, despair, drought. What's the problem though with our cow here? If it died there, what's missing?
Well, where's the rest of his body?
Where's the rest of it?
Yeah.
This photographer traveled with the skull and placed it in the photographs. It adds to the scene though, right? Death, despair, that's the thing. It's famously known as the perambulating skull because it just shows up in all of these photographs of the Old West, but there's never a body behind it, right? That's a clue. That's something to think about. Is this upper left-hand corner, is it dry? Is it hot? Is it desert conditions? Probably, absolutely. Is it a fun place to be? Are they growing crops there? Probably not. Does that message get hammered home with the skull? Absolutely. But it didn't belong there. Maps, you have to look at different type of stuff. You have to ask the same questions. Again, we naturally, especially now with just Google Earth and Google Maps, we don't think anything about maps. But maps have titles. They have different types. There's common features to a map. I was working with somebody one time and I was like, here, I need you to read this map. And they couldn't figure it out. They'd never seen a topography map. Like it's just a series of circles with numbers, right? That's the type of map they wanted the Google map to just tell them, go a quarter mile and take a left. You have to be able to read a map. We have kids who are like, a struggling reader, so we're going to give them cues to help them read. It's the same thing with maps, understanding symbols, purpose, context of the map, what's going on. I did an activity with our ELA, our secondary ELA specialist, and she said it publicly, so I always say that I can say it publicly. Morgan Dunton, we were talking about the different ways we approach things. We both picked the Civil War. We both brought things to a room, and we sat down for a couple hours and talked about it. And I brought 3 pictures of maps of Gettysburg. And she's like, I have no idea how to read a map. I can't read these. It was that symbol, the processing. What does the red mean? So we had to walk through it. And she goes, oh my gosh, I'd never thought about that, right? Because we approach the text differently. And so kids will need that piece. We can't just assume in giving a kid a map that they're going to get it. I say if you're going to, anytime you give a kid a map, if you give them just this one sentence to fill out, the map, whatever the title is, blank, by blank, created in blank, could be used as a source to understand blank. You've just sourced it and contextualized it. It's what you would do with Anne Frank's diary. You pay attention. And if you want to know more, Choices out of Brown University has an analyzing map. This is they charge for some of their stuff. This is one of their free units, analyzing a map. So this is pulled on one of the writing prompts from that piece. But nothing in a social studies world of the background knowledge and comprehension, anything that kids are handling needs to have this lens to it. Who wrote it? When did they do it? Why? What's it titled? What's the context? What does it mean? Can I corroborate it? This is how you build that content knowledge piece. I think this is our last one with political cartoons. Political cartoons are tough. Students will often just say, I don't get it, which is understandable because they often start with the literal decoding and miss the abstract parts of it. Political cartoons are rich with irony, sarcasm, and exaggeration, which if you don't get any of those things, then you usually don't get the work. So this is good for group work stuff. Have them sit in a group, talk through it. This is something I would model with kids. How do you pull it apart? Checking for labels, words, images. What do you think this means? Ask each student, how do you figure it out so they can share their metacognition for other students to see and hear. And I know I've said it in these webinars and they really all just start to blur together, but Doug Buell says the best thing you can do for your kids is to let them know you're thinking. It's the most valuable thing you can share with them because that's how they're going to get better at it. So if we have a political cartoon here, so let's start with our labels. What labels do we see here? I see a sign. Go ahead, Craig. Oh no, who just unmuted? Somebody just unmuted.
I was going to say sign.
Sign. So the sign says caution, children playing. Okay. Any other things in here? What else we need to break apart? What are the implied relationships? Eyes closed, back turned. What are the implied things going on here based on what people are doing? What do we assume they're doing?
Screen time.
Okay, they're on their devices. What's implied with body language?
They're not interacting with each other, and they are avoiding the actual playground in the background.
What's one way that we know they're avoiding that if we're talking about body language?
Their backs are to the actual playground.
Right. Backs are to the playground, they're sitting down, they're looking down. We're inferring that they're not interacting kind of based on the gestures that we're familiar with. So what's the irony here?
They are playing, possibly.
But?
Not what we see us play.
And also, caution, they're playing on their devices. What are they playing? So be aware of what they're doing.
Good one.
Because we really start to do on levels, like where we've seen this sign, caution children playing, would be in front of a playground so that you understand kids are running around playing. That sign in here is probably from before an iPad era, is where that would come from, but the kids still are playing. And Sonia's talking about the caution of what the kids might be playing. They're not playing basketball, teeter-totter, swings. They're playing. Right, so you have to understand that sarcasm, the irony, what's being exaggerated, what's not being exaggerated, what do the images mean? And if kids start to talk about some of those stuff and say, okay, well, Sonia, so tell us more about how you thought about that. Why did you start to think about what might be on the tablets is the cautionary piece. Have kids think through it because there's so many layers. The National Archives has a piece for kids to help them work with a political cartoon because you really have to break it apart before you can do anything else with it. You have to be able to decode it in order to contextualize it and then critique it. So if you're going to get started with using more primary sources, be okay with small successes and some failures. Sometimes you're going to give them things, kids just aren't going to get what you want them to get out of it, and that's okay. It's repeated exposure. Bruce Van Sledra, who we talked about at the beginning, some of his work with fifth graders, is that some of the first times elementary kids work with primary sources with conflicting viewpoints, they think other people are lying. Mine says chocolate ice cream is the best. That's a bad example because they might have opinion. They'll say person A said yes and this person B said no. Why do we have different opinions? And they don't think that the person writing it was lying. They think that their classmates are lying. Because why would, oh, Hannah, we've got garbage pickup now, so. But it takes time and repeated exposure for students to understand there's going to be multiple points of view if you give multiple documents. Give graphic organizers. I just came across this one the other day, so I bookmarked it just for this one. It's the 6 C's of a primary source. So you could click, if you were giving this to kids digitally, you could click the source information here, put them a link to what you wanted them to see. And then they have to find out the content, describe what you see. Citation, when was it created? Context, what was going on, where it was created. Connections, what prior knowledge, what do you already know about this thing? Communications, is this a point of view or is it biased? Is it reliable? And then what's your conclusion? So this is just a sample of a graphic organizer. I just found it. I'm like, oh, cool, I like this one. But we had up here as well, here's a graphic organizer. The Library of Congress and the National Archives both have a wide variety of graphic organizers for maps, images, art, photographs. I think both of them also have like an elementary and a secondary version. And I have a lot more of those things if you need help with that as well. Use the same scaffolding that you do any other type of activity. Don't break out something new. If you're used to doing small group work with kids and certain protocols, do those same things. Let them work in an environment that they are familiar with. And I put in the note there, whether this is synchronous or asynchronous work. Give them the work that they are familiar with. And now the last thing, the common complaint I'll get with this a lot of times is it takes so much time. I have a 45-minute activity for breaking down Washington crossing the Delaware, the famous painting. And somebody said, Joe, that's wonderful, but how do you spend 45 minutes on just that one painting? And my argument is always, how do you not? Because I do it all the time with adults, and adults have no idea what's in it. We've seen it hundreds of times. So what was the point of not doing anything with it if we've never learned? It's less coverage, it's deeper in. Do kids need to know 100 battles of the Civil War to understand the Civil War? Or can they wrestle with 5 diary entries of soldiers to really understand what was going on? What were the experiences of enslaved people? What was Lincoln thinking, right? These are the pieces. And they don't all have to deal with the same one either. I do a lot of voice and choice. Let kids ask a question about the Civil War that they want an answer, and then go find out the information to find that answer, right? I'll talk about Gettysburg. I'll talk about Joshua Chamberlain. I'll talk about the Emancipation Proclamation, or my Emancipation Proclamation tie today. We'll cover those basics, but instead of going deeper into more coverage, I shouldn't say deeper, instead of going wider with more coverage, let the kids go deep on something that interests them. Yep, Sonia, I have to go, or I don't have to go. I've got an office hour. Let me drop in very quickly. Here is your link to the survey. I will get this recorded. Let's see, wrong one. I will get this recorded and up as soon as possible. The presentation will be included as well. So I'll give everybody a minute to grab that if they need it. We'll move the discussion over to the office hours if anybody has further questions. Good luck for your 10 o'clock, Sonia.
Bye.
Does anybody need link info or anything for the 10 o'clock office hour in order to join there to have any discussions? I want to be able to open that up relatively soon, just in case people are waiting there. But I'm happy to have this discussion and answer any questions that we have over there. I'm going to put Heather on the spot and tell Heather that she better come over because I want to hear her thinking on this.
I'll be there.
Perfect. Jim, thank you, Jim.